In 1939, the world was on the brink of chaos. Japan was entangled in a fierce conflict in China, dealing with economic hardship and political instability back home. Meanwhile, Germany's invasion of Poland sparked a worldwide crisis, prompting Britain and France to declare war. Though Sweden proclaimed neutrality, it watched with unease as the Soviet Union attacked Finland and German troops advanced through Scandinavia. Japan was taken aback by Hitler's sudden agreement with Stalin, which shattered Tokyo's faith in its presumed Axis partner. As the conflict in Europe escalated, Japan declared non-involvement, opting out of Germany's military efforts. In this discussion, we'll examine how these interconnected crises, diplomatic betrayals, broken alliances, and shifting attitudes on neutrality, altered the foreign policies of Sweden and Japan. You'll discover how each nation maneuvered through an increasingly volatile world, holding on to their neutral stance while readying themselves for the possibility that isolation was no longer an option. Before stepping down in August 1939, Japanese Prime Minister Hironuma Kiichiro described the international situation as Fukuzatsu Kaiki, complex and unfathomable. This perfectly captured the tumultuous years leading up to Pearl Harbor. Up until the end of Hironuma's brief time in office, some in Sweden still clung to hopes of rekindling a Japanese-British alliance like that of World War I. They were deeply disheartened when a standoff in Tientsin revealed that Britain and Japan were now adversaries in a global power struggle. By this point, Europe's tensions were reaching a critical point, with Danzig becoming the center of a new crisis involving Germany, Poland, Britain, and France. On September 1, 1939, Hitler launched his attack on Poland, leading London and Paris to declare war on Berlin. Japan's role in this situation was ambiguous. Although Germany and Japan shared the Anti-Comintern Pact, this was above all an alliance aimed at the Soviet Union, not against Britain or France. Compounding Tokyo's feelings of betrayal was the news of Hitler's agreement with Stalin on August 23, just before the invasion of Poland. The infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Non-Aggression Pact turned everything Japan believed about its fascist ally in Europe upside down. Germany's shift toward its sworn enemy, which Japan was battling unofficially in Nomonhan, established a troubling power dynamic in Asia that alienated Japan significantly and prompted a major re-evaluation of its foreign policy. Additionally, Japan's military actions in China angered not just Britain and the USSR, but also the United States. Initially, the U.S. kept regular commercial relations. However, by mid-1938, Washington began implementing a moral embargo on war supplies to Japan. On July 26, 1939, Secretary of State Cordell Hull informed the Japanese ambassador that the U.S. would end the 1911 Treaty of Commerce and Navigation. This decision took effect 6 months later, paving the way for legal embargoes that ultimately led to a freeze of Japanese assets and an oil embargo in August 1941. On the Chinese front, Roosevelt referred to Japan's actions as a Chinese incident, enabling him to sidestep the neutrality laws Congress had been crafting since 1935. This classification meant that the cash and carry provisions of those neutrality acts wouldn't apply, allowing the U.S. to continue normal trade with China. Nonetheless, American public sentiment against arms trading, fueled by H.C. Engelbrecht and F.C. Hannigan's bestseller Merchants of Death, and the ensuing Nye Committee investigation into profits from the arms industry, constrained the Roosevelt administration's ability to support China with weapons. While the U.S. had delivered 339 planes to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists between 1933 and 1935, that number fell to 0 during the early years of the Sino-Japanese War. Only when the U.S. and Japan became clear adversaries in 1941 did American weapons exports to China rise significantly. Fortunately for Chiang, he found alternative support, with the most crucial backing coming from Hitler and Stalin. With existing ties dating back to the Weimar Republic, China secured an agreement in April 1936 that supplied 60% of its arms imports in exchange for wolfram and other ores. However, just months into full-scale war with Japan, Hitler decided to withdraw his support for Chiang. Until 1941, it was Stalin who stepped in to fill the gap by supplying Chiang with 1,235 planes, 1,600 artillery pieces, 14,000 machine guns, 50,000 rifles, and thousands of specialists, including military advisors, pilots, and engineers to support his resistance. Meanwhile, conditions in Europe turned increasingly complicated. Following the invasion of Poland, Stockholm announced its neutrality. In a widely publicized statement, Premier Per Albin Hansson confidently claimed that Sweden's defenses were well prepared, an overly optimistic view of the reality at that time. Just as in China, during the initial months of the war in Europe, many Swedes perceived themselves as detached observers of a major power struggle that seemed irrelevant to them, a sentiment that wouldn't hold for long. On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union launched an attack on Finland, marking the beginning of the Winter War. For the majority of Swedes, this situation felt distinctly separate from the conflicts in China or Poland. There was a strong desire to help the Finns, but the government was split. Foreign Minister Rickard Sandler advocated for active intervention, while many of his colleagues favored a more cautious approach. On December 12th, the government stepped down, making way for a national coalition consisting of all parliamentary parties except the communists. Per Albin Hansson remained as prime minister, but a non-political career diplomat, Christian Gunther, took over as foreign minister. He had previously held a high-ranking position at the ministry and had served as envoy to Norway. The Finns were disappointed when Sweden chose not to intervene. However, unlike other war fronts, Stockholm permitted not only the export of arms and ammunition to Finland, but also allowed volunteer troops to head east. This was the only conflict where Stockholm refrained from declaring neutrality, instead labeling itself as non-belligerent, a status not recognized in international law and often a precursor to eventual involvement in the war, as seen in Italy's case. The Winter War concluded in March 1940, but the situation in Northern Europe escalated dramatically with the German invasion and occupation of Denmark and Norway the following month. One consequence was the creation of the Skagerrak Barrage, a German minefield positioned between Kristiansand in Norway and Hanstholm in Denmark, serving as a passage from the North Sea to the Baltic Sea. This effectively split the Swedish merchant fleet into two nearly equal halves, each stuck on either side of this perilous barrier. Consequently, Swedish vessels occasionally received permission to navigate this military blockade with approval from both German and British officials, but foreign trade faced significant restrictions. Many ships that remained active, which made up 43% of Sweden's total shipping capacity, were leased to the Allies, causing the domestic economy to rely heavily on trade with Europe. By 1944, 85% of Sweden's foreign trade was linked to Germany and its occupied territories. In return for iron ore from Lapland, the Germans supplied coal and fertilizers. The situation grew more precarious for Stockholm in June 1940 when France fell and the Soviet Union annexed the three Baltic states. It became clear that Sweden's independence was also under threat. A stark sign of this was the increased German demand for passage of its soldiers from occupied Norway through Swedish land. After brief negotiations, Hansson's government felt they had no choice but to comply. Officially, these soldiers were on leave and supposedly paid for their travel on Swedish railways, but this was a clear violation of neutrality. A more critical incident arose after Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. Berlin began insisting that Sweden permit the transit of one of its army divisions from Norway to the front lines, warning that a refusal would be seen as an unfriendly act. This ultimatum sparked heated debates within the coalition government, with one faction firmly opposed to further concessions while others, including Prime Minister Hansson, leaned towards accepting the demands. At this point, King Gustav Vauth weighed in, threatening to step down if the German requests were not met, which the Prime Minister later interpreted as an influential stance. Ultimately, the government agreed to allow the transit. At the same time, the German and Finnish invasion of Soviet Russia sparked a level of enthusiasm among military circles sympathetic to Germany and Japan. This sentiment was voiced by Commander-in-Chief General Olaf Thornell. Public opinion was split among pro-Axis, pro-Allied, and neutral perspectives. Many believed that the Axis would triumph, which led to heightened self-censorship in public discourse. Even debates in Parliament became more cautious. Only a few newspapers, like Göteborg's Handels- och Sjöfartstidning, remained vocal, continuing their critiques of the Reich and the National Socialist regime despite personal appeals, even from King Gustav V. The German legation, disregarding Swedish press freedoms, lodged strong protests, which prompted Minister of Justice K.G. Westman to ban the paper's distribution on the grounds of national security. Ironically, the tense international climate brought a sense of calm to Swedish-Japanese relations. Since the Mukden incident, the two nations had maintained a wary relationship marked by mutual suspicion. While they followed separate diplomatic paths in Geneva, trade thrived. This complicated situation persisted into 1939. For example, when news broke about the termination of the United States-Japanese trade treaty, media in Stockholm reacted positively, viewing it as punishment for Japan. The Social Democraten interpreted this move as the start of long-awaited sanctions against an aggressor state, something that wouldn't materialize in a significant way for another 2 years. These opinions were certainly popular. As noted earlier, only a few staunch economic liberalists, ultra-right figures, and occasional anti-colonialists continued to argue that Japan wasn't at fault for the conflict in China. However, no one in Sweden called for an end to their own treaty with Japan. Media remained quiet on Sweden's dealings with the empire. In fact, as the European war loomed, diplomatic ties with Japan appeared to strengthen. Stockholm even welcomed another goodwill visit from Fujiwara Jinjiro, who created a garden for the Japanese tea house in the city. He met with Prime Minister Hansen and had an audience with King Gustav V. Fujiwara's visit was met with positive coverage in the Swedish press. When the new Japanese envoy, Matsushima Shikao, arrived in late 1939, his goal of promoting friendly relations was not entirely improbable, even with the tense international climate. He noted that the conflicts in East Asia were causing some tensions, but still described Swedish-Japanese relations as exceedingly good. Sweden's approach had shifted to being, if not more friendly, at least less confrontational towards Japan. There was no denying the unfairness of the situation. Bernhard Karlgren, a sinologist and an expert on East Asian issues, encapsulated the Swedish viewpoint on Asia in a printed work from 1940. He pointed out that Manchukuo remained a puppet of the empire, and that Japan's actions in China were not only unlawful, but also a significant military error. Despite this, Stockholm reluctantly accepted that force could establish legitimacy. The protest movement of 1938 and the failed calls for a boycott were simply the last expressions of civil society's moral opposition to violence against civilians. Yet, the fierce resistance Swedish diplomats once displayed against Japan's activities in Manchukuo during the League of Nations sessions in 1932 to 1933 had turned into a sense of resignation about the efficacy of force, something that had been supposedly declared obsolete just a few years earlier by the Covenant of the League and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The once passionate advocates for collective security had clearly lost the argument. Nearly everyone in Sweden, apart from Carl Lindhagen, had to concede that national defense took precedence. This was true within both the government and media. Meanwhile, Japan's warfare in China scarcely made the news anymore. In fact, mentions of Japan were dwindling in Swedish newspapers starting in 1937, a trend only interrupted by the beginnings and ends of the Pacific War. As support for the League of Nations diminished, public and private objections to Japanese actions also faded, resolving the conflict and leading to more normalized relations with Japan. There were some indications that Japanese leaders attempted to improve Swedish views through public diplomacy, like the gifting of the tea house and its garden, but overall, the shift in focus had little to do with Japanese actions. It was the natural result of a swift transformation in the international landscape, reshaping both Swedish public discourse and foreign policy. With the League system in decline, Sweden reverted to its long-standing policy of neutrality, which, from Japan's perspective, gradually tamed the Swedish hound. To grasp this change, we must revisit the point when Swedish foreign policy shifted from collective security to neutrality. Although Sweden's notion of traditional neutrality dates back to the 18th and 19th centuries and World War I, it wasn't entrenched in international law like that of other European neutrals. Countries such as Belgium, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland had their permanent neutralities formally established by treaties. For them, joining an alliance would have been deemed illegal. Sweden, however, had a different approach. There were no domestic laws compelling the government to stay neutral in the conflicts of others. Neither the constitution nor legislative acts dictated such a stance. For Sweden, neutrality was fundamentally a matter of foreign policy. By the 1920s, it had also evolved to hold significant cultural value and become central to national identity. This might clarify why Sweden's shift away from neutrality in favor of the League's collective security strategy was a gradual and quiet departure rather than a bold renouncement of its prior principles. Neither Parliament nor the government explicitly stated that their neutral tradition would be replaced by a new foreign policy doctrine. Instead, neutrality was quietly phased out as Sweden adapted to become a participant in the League system. This is further highlighted by Switzerland, which required and received written assurances to maintain its permanent neutrality prior to joining the League. The unspoken decline of Swedish neutrality is also evident in the absence of discussion on the subject. For 15 years, there had been no significant parliamentary debate regarding neutrality. Only the events in Abyssinia made it necessary to reconsider. The question of whether neutrality should once more form the foundation of Swedish foreign policy was closely linked to the League's success. Throughout this period, a true consensus among political parties on the League's role was never achieved. From the outset, there was a significant divide between the idealist school of thought, which valued collective security, international disarmament, and sanctions, and the realist perspective, which viewed such security as both unattainable and undesirable. The Social Democrats and the left wing of the Liberal Party championed the idealistic approach, while the Conservatives and the Farmers' League primarily held the realist view. Throughout most of the interwar period, the Conservatives found themselves in the minority. Consequently, Sweden's international policy was largely driven by politicians committed to the League's idealistic goals. However, the harsh reality of Japan's actions in 1931 and Italy's in 1936, alongside the lukewarm responses from other great powers, led to significant disappointment for those who supported this idealism. Swedish diplomats had engaged passionately in Geneva, advocating for binding agreements and interventions against aggressors, motivated by the belief that smaller nations would greatly benefit from the League's collective security framework. During World War I, smaller neutral nations were among the first drawn into the conflict, as the great powers deemed the laws of neutrality secondary to their immediate wartime needs. The experiences of Belgium and Luxembourg, whose neutral rights were swiftly disregarded by Germany, left a lasting impact on even those neutrals that emerged from the war unscathed. As a result, Europe's most resolute neutrals, Sweden and Switzerland, became founding members of the League of Nations in 1920. This move had potentially significant implications for their neutral status, as the League's covenant mandated an intense commitment to a global alliance where member states would defend one another through sanctions and military means. Article 16 of the covenant firmly established the principle of one for all and all for one in a binding international security treaty. Yet, 15 years later, Europe's smaller states painfully realized that enforcing the promises of collective security was far more challenging in practice than the written agreements suggested. No sanctions were imposed on Japan, and Italy faced only inadequate measures, which did nothing to stop its aggression toward Abyssinia. By early 1936, Swedish politics grappled with two connected issues stemming from the League's inability to protect its weaker members. First, should Sweden continue to follow League sanctions? And second, if the League was indeed failing, how could Sweden ensure its own security moving forward? Answers to both of these questions came slowly. Initially, in the Riksdag debates of early 1936, No party, aside from the small Socialist Party, seriously questioned Sweden's commitment to League sanctions. Prominent figures like Rickard Sandler and Östen Undén from the Social Democrats, along with conservative leader Gösta Bagge, stood firmly in favor of maintaining sanctions against Italy. Breaking ties with the League and dishonoring international commitments was not an option. Sandler and Undén worked hard to persuade their colleagues that the League's failure was not a foregone conclusion. They argued that instead of disengaging, Sweden should aim for a reformed League that could operate more effectively. However, this argument began to falter as Italy's aggressive actions in Abyssinia gained momentum and the great powers showed little inclination to uphold the covenant, particularly exemplified by the Hoare-Laval Plan. Over time, the Social Democrats shifted their perspectives, moving toward a more cautious approach to international involvement. Some came to see that the so-called hungry nations had legitimate grievances and deserved to be appeased, mirroring the views of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. They distanced themselves from the ideals of Versailles and, by extension, Geneva. A different group of Social Democrats began to argue that, although moving towards a neutral foreign policy might be necessary, it would only be a temporary retreat from the League's ideals, with hopes that the League would regain its strength once Britain and France were adequately armed. Lastly, there was a faction that opposed appeasement altogether, embracing the realistic stance that national self-reliance was the only viable path to safeguarding Swedish interests. The remaining internationalists drew inspiration from the anti-fascist fight in Spain and joined the boycott against Japan, backed fully by the Swedish Communist Party. In early May 1936, Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Abyssinia, fled into exile to escape Mussolini's advancing forces, which could have prompted sanctions from the League. However, with Germany having reoccupied the Rhineland 2 months prior, France was unlikely to support an oil embargo against Italy. This inability to take economic action on behalf of a small nation echoed loudly in Stockholm. Gösta Bagge was the first to shift his stance, despite having previously supported sanctions, arguing that Sweden's security should not rely on external powers. He advocated for bolstering Sweden's military defense and reviving its nearly forgotten policy of neutrality. During a parliamentary debate on May 26, 1936, Bagge expressed, almost hesitantly, that amid the emergence of new great power alliances, Sweden must cling to its, yes, traditional neutrality when situations demand it. He wasn't advocating for Sweden's withdrawal from the League. Only the Socialist Party favored that. Yet the conservative leader proposed reforms to align League membership with neutrality, primarily by softening Article 16 to free Sweden from sanctions that had so poorly assisted Abyssinia and China. Naturally, Foreign Minister Sandler opposed Bagge's ideas, stating that reverting to neutrality would mean abandoning League sanctions, which would either ignore the conflict in Abyssinia or necessitate leaving the League. Neither option seemed practical to him. Undén also critiqued Bagge. It may seem simple and convenient to suggest leaving the League of Nations in favor of neutrality and defense, but neutrality isn't a solution that fits all situations, especially as war technologies and economic relations evolve. However, as spring turned to summer in 1936, the confidence of the Social Democrats began to wane. In his closing remarks, Foreign Minister Sandler captured the sentiment of idealists who were grappling with the potential shortcomings of the League. He stated that, while he recognized the necessity of neutrality at times, no one could genuinely believe that neutrality should be the ultimate aim. To adopt a stance of neutrality is, in essence, to admit failure in the essential goal of preventing war, which should always be the foremost priority for statesmen. Even when this goal seems daunting, it cannot simply be dismissed. On June 19th, the Hansen government fell due to an unrelated pension issue. In terms of foreign policy, the change had little impact, as Sandler's successor, K.G. Westman from the Farmers' League, shared similar views with conservatives. Westman asserted that as long as Sweden was part of the League of Nations, the country should uphold the traditional concept of neutrality as the foundation of its foreign policy, viewing its relationship with the League as a functional framework. During his brief tenure as foreign minister, Westman faced an opportunity to express Sweden's dilemmas and concerns on an international platform. On July 1st, a collective of neutrality-focused nations, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, and Switzerland, released a joint statement urging caution against further undermining the League's tenets. They emphasized the importance of seeking practical solutions for its shortcomings, stating that they found it unacceptable for certain articles of the Covenant, particularly those related to disarmament, to be ignored while others were enforced. They believed it was vital to do everything possible to ensure the League's success as an endeavor to create an international society grounded in law. Their hopeful call for reform was paired with a cautionary note, asserting that as long as the Covenant was applied inconsistently, they would need to consider this reality in relation to Article 16. The neutrals ultimately sought to compel the great powers to take action, or, if that failed, to be released from any future obligations to support sanctions or military actions through the League. Yet, just 5 days later, on July 6th, the Coordination Committee of the League recommended lifting all sanctions against Italy, effectively acknowledging Mussolini's actions in East Africa. This was directly opposed to the neutrals' requests and signaled the end of their efforts in Geneva. Following the inability to assist Abyssinia, discussions in the Riksdag about Sweden's neutrality policy became commonplace. Topics included the involvement of Swedish volunteers in the Spanish Civil War and Sweden's stance toward the League. Even after the Social Democrats returned to power on September 28, 1936, the Swedish government adopted a different perspective. Rickard Sandler, who resumed his role as foreign minister, stated on November 7, 1937, in a speech at Uppsala University, that Article 16 no longer held any obligation because a law that doesn't apply equally to everyone and in all situations has ceased to be a law. 2 months later, Sweden, along with the Netherlands and Switzerland, officially declared its intent to disregard Article 16. By the end of the decade, the idea of collective security had shifted for internationalists. Although Sweden briefly attempted to create a coalition of like-minded Nordic neutrals to counter the rising power dynamics in Europe, this initiative never moved past the planning stage. When Hitler invaded Poland, Sweden found itself isolated. While significant support was provided to Finland during the Winter War, Sweden maintained its non-belligerent stance or issued declarations of neutrality with each new conflict. The vision of collective security was definitively over. Japan, on the other hand, faced its own escalating crisis, one of its own making. Domestically, the empire felt the strain as public support for the war diminished due to the economic toll of the occupation. Parliament was compelled to approve an additional war credit of 2.5 billion yen in the fall of 1937, a staggering amount, given that regular annual expenses were 2.8 billion yen. To address the financial crisis and the perceived need for austerity, the government prohibited anything deemed a luxury and began to promote frugality as a virtue. More individuals found work in the armaments sector, and a movement for spiritual mobilization emerged. In 1938, new laws granted the government emergency powers, effectively dismantling political pluralism. Parliament became a mere rubber stamp, and the economy fell under strict government control. To curb currency shortages, a licensing system was implemented for all imports. Work hours were lengthened, and unions combined with employer associations, branded as patriotic industry federations. Essentially, the war effort marked the end of liberal trends in Japanese business. Efforts to create an economic bloc comprising the Japanese Empire, Manchukuo, and China couldn't change this reality. Real wages and living standards began to decline, and by 1939, energy and food shortages began to surface. Inflation escalated, requiring a freeze on prices and wages. As Japan approached its 2,600-year anniversary in early 1940, the nation found itself in an economic siege of its own making. In the spring of 1939, a new front unexpectedly opened in Northeast Asia. Following months of border skirmishes at the Manchu-Mongolian border, the Kwantung Army was thrust into an all-out battle at Nomonhan against Mongolian and Soviet forces. Due to a series of miscalculations, primarily the belief that the Red Army was too weak to challenge Japanese troops. The conflict escalated into what could be termed a war in all but name. Japan dismissed the situation with euphemisms, calling it merely another incident. But it was a significant incident indeed. Over 20,000 lives were lost from both sides, with 100,000 troops engaged for 4 months, and the possibility loomed that the Soviet Union might officially declare war. Such a situation would have spelled disaster for Tokyo for multiple reasons, especially since a genuine war could have triggered the export restriction mechanisms of U.S. neutrality laws. Fortunately, it didn't escalate that far, as Stalin was also reluctant to draw Hitler's attention to the fact that a significant part of his Red Army was occupied in the east. Consequently, both Japan and the USSR downplayed the severity of the conflict. Japan's military leadership was divided over the empire's future. The Navy believed that Japan's best strategy lay in Southeast Asia, anticipating inevitable clashes with Britain, France, and eventually the United States. Conversely, the Army focused on North Asia, with Nomonhan serving as a crucial test. In early 1939, the political landscape in Tokyo still leaned toward the Army's perspective, as the government was aligned with Germany in fighting Bolshevism. The Anti-Comintern Pact, which had been in place since late 1936, was meant to create a united front against the Soviet Union. However, it turned out to be a costly and empty agreement for Tokyo. The commitment from Germany was lacking, and the situation became even more complicated when Hitler shifted his ambitions. As tensions rose in Europe, he urged Japan to align its aggression toward Britain and France rather than the USSR, demanding a formal agreement. Reports suggested that during talks in Berlin, Hitler even threatened to abandon the Anti-Comintern Pact if Japan didn't agree to a tighter military alliance. The conflicting views on who the real enemy was for the Axis powers led to a standstill in Tokyo and eventually resulted in a separate pact between Germany and Italy in March 1939. This Pact of Steel promised mutual military support in case one of them faced conflict. Japan, however, did not join this alliance, as the pressure from Germany only increased tensions within the inner cabinet circles. The Army and War Ministers favored a closer alliance, while the Navy grew apprehensive about entanglements that could lead them into a European conflict. This indecision in Tokyo persisted. A significant diplomatic setback came on August 23 when, amid the fighting at Nomonhan, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with the USSR, and the timing was no accident. Stalin, who had an alliance proposition from Britain and France, was at least partly swayed by the Japanese threat in the Far East to align himself with Germany, considering Germany's relationship with Japan. A war on two fronts posed a severe risk to the USSR, prompting Stalin to insist that Berlin leverage its ties to Japan to improve relations between the two nations. This quickly unfolded after Japan realized that Soviet military forces were available for action in the east. Consequently, Tokyo agreed to a ceasefire starting September 16, 1939, just a day before the Red Army entered eastern Poland. For Japan, the emerging closeness between Germany and the Soviet Union felt like a significant betrayal of the Anti-Comintern Pact, leading Japanese media to question the viability of maintaining friendly ties with Germany. The situation led to the downfall of Hiranuma Kichiro's cabinet, replaced by the Abe Nobuyuki government. In his first address, General Abe openly considered breaking the pact with Germany. The defeat at Nomonhan and the non-aggression pact shifted Japan's view of the Soviet Union. Stalin proved to be a more powerful military adversary than expected, and his diplomatic maneuvering left Japan isolated from its European partners. This left the Abe administration unable to contemplate support for Germany when conflict erupted in Europe. On September 5th, shortly after Britain and France declared war, Abe issued a succinct statement saying that Japan intended to remain uninvolved in the European conflict and would focus on resolving the situation in China. The following day, the Foreign Ministry sent a note to diplomats of the warring countries, as well as to the United States and Italy, asserting Japan's non-involvement, while expecting that all nations would prevent incidents that could compel Japan to abandon its policy of non-intervention. This served as a veiled warning directed at Moscow, London, and Paris. To resolve the Chinese affair, it was crucial for European and American support for the Chiang Kai-shek regime in Chongqing to cease and to avoid incidents similar to those at Nomonhan. Abe's remarks carefully steered clear of the term neutrality. The legal implications that might arise under international law were not something the government was eager to suggest. The Gaimusho had a solid grasp of the nuances of neutrality proclamations, having utilized them before. In 1939, they even conducted 2 studies on what these proclamations would mean. Declaring neutrality would have forced Japan into an unbiased stance, an essential aspect of its earlier declarations, during a time when relationships with Germany, the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States were all strained, and the cabinet preferred flexibility in its policies. Japan had no intention of emulating the United States, which since 1936 had introduced 4 neutrality laws that banned trade in war materials with nations involved in conflict. Additionally, President Roosevelt had recently announced that the U.S. would uphold true neutrality. For the sake of maintaining Axis cooperation, Tokyo couldn't appear to take cues from the U.S. From an international law perspective, a declaration of neutrality wasn't even necessary to gain the rights of a neutral power. The mere fact that there was no state of war automatically activated the relevant laws, a point not lost on contemporary observers. Thus, refraining from declaring strict neutrality like the United States or Sweden, while also not acting as Germany's ally, was Japan's optimal course of action, keeping all options open under the policy of non-involvement. For almost 2 years, both the government and national media tirelessly emphasized Japan's dual foreign policy aims of staying uninvolved in Europe while seeking dominance in Asia. As September 1939 came to a close, the fractures of a new international system due to the European conflict began to take shape. Some nations were engaged in battle, others were not, but every country felt the effects. Smaller neutral nations faced the threat of attack from either side, while larger neutrals like Italy, Spain, the USSR, and the United States were being courted to join the fray for ideological reasons. For the first 2 years, Sweden and Japan found themselves in relatively parallel situations, wary yet cordial with Germany, subtly menaced by the USSR, but, most crucially, not engaged in war. Despite their differing international ambitions and military strategies, Sweden and Japan found themselves on the neutral end of the European conflict. The tripartite pact established in September 1940 didn't fundamentally change that. While it formed a defensive alliance among Rome, Berlin, and Tokyo for Japan, it primarily served as a means to deter the United States rather than as a counterbalance to Britain or France. The pact did not involve Japan in the European War, as it only required military support in the event one of the Allies was attacked, not for offensive actions, which Hitler and Mussolini frequently launched. Interestingly, the Swedish press viewed the pact with realism, believing it would likely have little impact and not endure. Many newspapers expressed surprise at Japan's inclusion in the Axis powers, which they still thought consisted only of Rome and Berlin. In 1940, Japan's cabinet underwent 2 reshuffles. On January 16th, Prime Minister Abe passed leadership to Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, a Navy officer who, like Hiranuma Kichiro, struggled to maintain power. His term ended on July 21st due to military opposition to his pro-Anglo-American and anti-German stance. After the resignation of his army minister, Hara Shunroku, and the refusal of any army general to step in, Yonai had to resign, as the constitution mandated active-duty military members in the cabinet, effectively giving both services veto power over the executive. The following day, a civilian government emerged under the respected yet indecisive Konoe Fumimaro. Though Konoe had previously served as a relatively moderate prime minister from 1937 to 1939, his return did not signal a shift toward a more conciliatory foreign policy. He was involved in establishing the Taisei Yokusankai, a party to eliminate all others, and maintained close ties with the military, appointing the influential Matsuoka Yosuke as foreign minister. Matsuoka, known for his strong criticism of China at Geneva and for leading Japan out of the League in 1933, had been praised by the Japanese media for navigating around problematic smaller states. He shifted the direction of Yonai's cabinet, steering Japan toward a closer alliance with Germany. One of his initial actions was a striking overhaul in the Gaimusho. The Swedish minister in Tokyo noted that shortly after taking office, Foreign Minister Matsuoka replaced 5 ambassadors, 19 ministers, and 11 consul generals with individuals deemed more aligned with the new direction. Within the domestic sphere, officials with pro-English and pro-American sentiments were also swapped out for new personnel. During Matsuoka's time in office, the Navy finally set aside its reluctance toward a military alliance with Hitler, giving Matsuoka the go-ahead to negotiate the tripartite pact. Yet, perhaps more significantly for Swedish-Japanese relations was his unexpected triumph in securing a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union. Signed in Moscow on April 13, 1941, by Matsuoka and Stalin, the pact sought to mirror the German-Soviet non-aggression pact and was seen from Japan's perspective as a step toward forming a Berlin-Rome, Moscow-Tokyo axis. Not only did this neutrality pact enhance the political relations between Japan and the USSR, paving the way for shipping and payment agreements, but it also allowed for the redeployment of Japanese troops in China. However, to Matsuoka's disappointment, the Liaison Conference decided not to increase military pressure on Chiang Kai-shek, choosing instead to open a new front in Indochina, even at the risk of provoking conflict with Britain and the United States. This Navy-led venture into Southeast Asia faced challenges as Hitler proved to be an erratic ally. On June 22, he invaded the Soviet Union, shattering the non-aggression pact, which left Matsuoka stunned. This was another setback for the cabinet's military strategy, derailing all plans on Japan's side. With the vision of a pan-Eurasian axis now in ruins, Matsuoka shifted his stance to support the Army's suggestion that they should discard the neutrality pact and seize the opportunity for an offensive against the Soviet Union. Yet, Konoe did not concur, and some in Kasumigaseki even argued for scrapping the tripartite pact instead of the neutrality pact. Ultimately, no action was taken, and the empire continued its precarious alliance with the Reich while upholding its neutrality toward the USSR. Despite Matsuoka nearly undermining his own agreement with Stalin, the neutrality pact turned out to be quite resilient. It was set to be renewable and last at least 5 years, but it was only violated on August 9, 1945, when the Soviet Union joined the Allies against Japan following the second atomic bomb's devastation of Nagasaki. This meant that from December 1941 to August 19, 1945, Japan and the Soviet Union maintained a stance of mutual neutrality while each engaged in combat with their respective allies. The Swiss envoy to Japan, Camille Gourget, described this in his memoirs as the strangest neutrality one has ever seen, a phrase that, not surprisingly, caught on among historians. For Swedish-Japanese relations, the neutrality pact held its own importance. It established a trade route for as long as access through the Baltic Sea was possible from Stockholm. This was significant, considering that for the following 5 years, Sweden's 2 main interests related to Japan, trade and diplomacy, would depend on this accessibility. To devise a new foreign policy after the collapse of the League system, the Swedish government had to navigate the conflicting desires of the country's most vocal pressure groups. On one side, the export industry argued that it represented prosperity and employment for Swedish workers, advocating for extensive economic engagement with all parties both inside and outside of Europe. Conversely, left-leaning groups prioritized ideology, insisting on a distance from states that breached the law. Unlike in the early 1930s, however, the latter did not prevail this time. Internationalism and collective security now posed considerable risks. Even steadfast figures like Östen began to recognize the necessity of a fresh security strategy and a rethinking of Swedish diplomacy. Early in 1938, he faced the challenge of clarifying Sweden's position in Geneva, where a committee was working on reforming the League. He reminded the committee members that economic sanctions were meant to be mandatory and automatic when the League condemned aggression. Yet, despite the resolutions passed in the fall of 1937, no nation had taken any action. He concluded that the sanctions system was effectively suspended. His speech served as a subtle indictment of the great powers for not meeting their obligations. even though this turned back on him, as it was well known that the Swedish government had not been particularly proactive in Brussels. Instead, Sandler began to look for a regional answer to the security issue. In April 1938, he declared that Sweden would evaluate security within a Nordic context. This shift in Sweden's security approach, moving away from the League and towards neutrality, was undeniably complicated. It was neither straightforward nor widely accepted, and it carried the weight of history. To maintain at least a semblance of policy coherence, its diplomats had to cleverly disguise this new strategy. A case in point was Sweden's stance on the League's censure of Japan following the Brussels Conference. On one hand, the country did not wish to choose sides, yet it had already committed to the solidarity expressed in the conference's declaration. Moreover, since the fall of 1936, Sweden had held a non-permanent seat on the League Council, which elevated its influence. Therefore, it had to pay lip service to the League's viewpoint. As recently as January 1938, the government instructed its diplomats to keep Sweden's position on Japan and China unchanged, maintaining that Japan was to blame. This meant that its diplomats could not officially adopt a stance of political neutrality in the matter. However, further estrangement from Japan was also not the goal, necessitating careful diplomatic maneuvering. For instance, when Japan's envoy, Kuriyama Shigeru, asked acting Foreign Minister K.G. Westman for Sweden's neutrality within the League, Westman offered an unexpected response. He noted that since the situation in China was merely an incident, as the Japanese claimed, and neutrality applied only in wartime, the question of Swedish neutrality here was moot. This was a response Kuriyama had no choice but to accept, yet it reduced Swedish policy to a legalistic nuance, likely leaving Westman with an unsatisfactory feeling. The League's weaknesses became more pronounced at the annual assembly in the fall of 1938, when deeper divisions emerged. Sweden and a few other nations expressed their doubts about the effectiveness of the sanctions system, only to be met with criticism from Soviet Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov, who labeled their concerns as defeatism. Sandler, for his part, hesitated to align with the Chinese perspective on the matter. Then, on September 30th, the League unexpectedly called for sanctions against Japan, but no member paid any attention to this decision. It's questionable whether the matter was even discussed at the UD in Stockholm. In May 1939, a Chinese envoy informed Sandler of China's intention to seek the formation of a committee to coordinate sanctions. However, the UD responded that the necessary conditions for such cooperation were lacking, and Sweden would not support the initiative. By the end of July, the Chinese Foreign Ministry reached out to Sweden and other League Council members, requesting an investigation into Japanese aerial attacks on civilian targets, highlighting that little progress had been made since the resolution from autumn 1937. The situation for China remained stagnant as discussions continued until Hitler invaded Poland, bringing the League's efforts regarding the Far East to a halt. Once the European War commenced, no further deliberations were possible. In December 1939, the League expelled the Soviet Union following its invasion of Finland, and the League never reconvened until its dissolution in 1946. The failure of the League and Sweden's rejection of a proposed Nordic neutral bloc meant that Stockholm's diplomatic efforts became fundamentally bilateral, as there was no remaining multilateral platform. Nevertheless, it should be noted that the shift towards bilateral diplomacy in Asia had already begun prior to this, with the outbreak of the European War simply marking the culmination of that trend. For instance, while envoy J.E.E. Holtman was assigned to the Republic of China, also representing Sweden in Nanking, the growing complexity of the situation prompted Stockholm to expand its diplomatic efforts by appointing two distinct successors in late 1936. Johan Beck-Friis was dispatched to Shanghai, soon to be occupied by Japan, while Widar Bagge took on the role of envoy to Tokyo. After September 1939, virtually all of Sweden's diplomatic interactions with Japan became bilateral, with only a few instances of interneutral cooperation. As a result of this shift towards bilateralization, Swedish diplomats in Tokyo gained significant prominence as key observers and negotiators. It's important to take a moment to think about the structure and organization of the Swedish mission. At the forefront during the peak of the war years was Vidar Bagge, who took charge of the Swedish legation. Born on April 30th, 1886, he was a career diplomat like his predecessor Hultman, progressing through the necessary ranks at the Foreign Office to become a senior diplomat, beginning his journey as an attaché in 1919. His early postings in junior roles included Helsinki, London, Brussels, and Rome throughout 1922. He returned to Helsinki in 1924, where he rose to the position of First Secretary by 1925. In 1928, he was assigned to Tokyo, starting his role as First Secretary on May 24. This was also the year when the legation's leadership transitioned from Iwerlöf to Hultman. Thus, Bagge spent 3 years working under the very man whose position he would ultimately take over nearly a decade later. His time in Tokyo was briefly interrupted by a short stint as Consul General in Shanghai from May to September 1930. By early 1931, he was back in Stockholm, becoming the head of the trade division. He served there for 3 years, alongside brief assignments as chargé d'affaires in Warsaw and counselor to the legation in Paris. In January 1937, Bagge returned to Tokyo as envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary, marking him as Sweden's top diplomat in East Asia. He remained in this role until he left on April 13, 1945, just before the war's conclusion. Officially, he was in charge of the Swedish legation until September 1945, although by then, the chargé d'affaires, Erik von Sydow, held the title of Sweden's senior diplomat in Japan. Before retiring from the Foreign Service, Bagge's last position was as envoy to Cairo from 1945 to 1951. Following that, he worked with the Swedish multinational Atlas Copco until the age of 80, and eventually moved to Paris, where he passed away in 1970. Bagge was quite an unusual diplomat. He remained unmarried and had no children. While many diplomats and statesmen from World War II kept diaries or went on to write memoirs reflecting on their experiences, Bagge did not maintain such records, or if he did, they have not survived. Today, we can only access the reports, telegrams, and letters he wrote in his official role to piece together his time in wartime Japan. It appears he wasn't fond of seeking the spotlight either, as images of him are quite scarce. The 2 photographs we have were found only after thorough digging through Swedish newspaper archives. Little is known about his personal life. Though he wasn't a socialite outside of work, he was well connected among his diplomatic peers and the Japanese officials he interacted with. Sir Robert Craigie, the British ambassador, noted him as one of the few foreign members of the esteemed Fujiwara Club, a golf club where one could mingle with Japanese political leaders and others without raising suspicions from the security police. Among the regular attendees at Fujiwara was Prince Konoe, known for his skills on the golf course, and these were likely the moments when Bagge forged relationships with key Japanese politicians. His connection with Prince Konoe would later prove significant. Bagge was regarded among Japan's elite as a friend to the country, and he was referred to as a Japanophile in Japanese accounts. Shigemitsu Mamoru, in his memoirs, expressed admiration for Bagge's lengthy service in Japan and described him as someone who thoroughly understood the nation and was well respected for his sincerity. Additional insights about Bagge come from the diary of Camille Gorget, the Swiss minister in Japan. With all the courtesy due a colleague of similar rank, Gorget remarked that Bagge enjoyed sailing on his flat boat, a necessity for regattas in the area. When visiting him, one might think he resembled a natural science professor rather than an athlete, as he didn't appear particularly muscular. Yet that impression is misleading. On the lake's shores, he exhibited the carefree spirit of a young sailor, and I once saw him leap around the boat like a gymnast while trying to free a rope caught in the wind. Gorget also noted Bagge's boldness in the face of challenges. On December 16, 1944, an earthquake rattled the legation while the Swiss were dining with guests. Everyone jumped to their feet, fearing debris from the ceiling might fall, except for Mr. Bagge, the Swedish minister, who stayed seated, unfazed. It's worth noting that in Gorget's accounts, Bagge doesn't appear as prominently as other diplomats. even though the Swedish legation became one of the few neutral missions to advocate for Allied interests in Japan alongside Switzerland, and despite their frequent collaboration, Gorge's diary, which spans over 500 pages, lacks detailed accounts of their interactions. He never referred to Bagui with the same warmth he reserved for the Spanish minister, Santiago Méndez de Vigo y Méndez de Vigo, whom he affectionately called "my dear friend." This suggests that Gorge and Bag didn't share a similar rapport. Bagge likely maintained a professional distance from his fellow diplomats. When Bagge arrived in early 1937, the Swedish legation was modest and limited in resources. He had just one secretary and one chancellor to support a tiny Swedish community of about 100 people. In contrast, there was a relatively broad consular network in place, with 5 honorary consulates operating throughout the Japanese Empire. For perspective, Switzerland had no consulates in Japan at that time, and Spain had merely 1. Sweden, however, employed 4 honorary consuls on the mainland and an additional one in Dairen on the Kwantung leased territory. The role of these consulates was termed honorary because they weren't staffed by career diplomats, but by businessmen appointed as consuls to handle clerical tasks, primarily trade facilitation. Some of these honorary consuls weren't even Swedish citizens. For instance, Frederick Ringer in Nagasaki was British. Born in Japan, he was a merchant who also served as the Norwegian consul, while managing the trading company Holm, Ringer & Co. In Kobe, Ernest William James, a British citizen, enjoyed significant wealth. The consul in Yokohama, Gusta Guston, was Swedish, and as we noted earlier, he was quite vocal about promoting Swedish trade interests. However, he left his role in late 1938 and didn't collaborate much with Vidar Bagge. Guston's position was first filled temporarily by G.A. Neville, manager of the foreign trading company Nickel and Lyons Company Limited, and then permanently by R.G. Bell, the owner of another trading company, starting May 12, 1939. The biographies of the honorary consuls reveal how the Swedish consular network relied on the expatriate communities from various countries. Many consuls were not Swedish nationals. Instead, they either worked for Swedish firms or had strong connections to them. This made it easier to fill these positions compared to career diplomats, who faced more challenges and delays in finding replacements. In 1940, Erich von Sydow arrived in Tokyo as the new legation secretary, stepping in for Hugo Wistrand, who had been reassigned to Berlin. It wasn't until 1945 that the legation saw an external reinforcement, with Olof Ripa becoming second secretary shortly before Bagge's departure. Ripa remained after von Sydow left, ultimately becoming the last Swedish diplomat in Tokyo during the American occupation, holding the title of diplomatic representative to the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers. He departed in 1949. Although neither Sweden nor Japan was involved in the early phases of the war in Europe, Bagge soon faced challenges that posed serious threats to Swedish interests. By early 1940, Swedish-Japanese sea traffic began to decline, coinciding with the German occupation of Denmark and Norway in April, as well as the Winter War between Finland and the USSR. With 3 out of 5 Nordic countries under foreign control, many in Japan started to believe that Scandinavia no longer held any significant value in global affairs. According to Bagge, the Asahi Shimbun, one of Japan's largest daily newspapers, declared that the war meant Japanese diplomatic presence in Sweden was no longer necessary. Initially, Bagge only reported on newspaper articles that supported this viewpoint, but it was becoming a widely held belief. In early January 1941, the Japanese minister to Sweden, Matsushima Shikao, was one of the diplomats contacted by Foreign Minister Matsuoka, who sent him to Berlin as a special representative for tripartite negotiations. The issue was that Matsuoka did not appoint a new envoy to Stockholm, which created complications for the Swedish Foreign Office, adding another obstacle to bilateral relations. Some worried this indicated that Japan doubted Sweden's ability to maintain its independence in a German-occupied Europe. Bagge considered it crucial for Sweden that a Japanese minister be sent back to Stockholm as soon as possible. He quickly visited the foreign minister to point out that the Japanese media was mistaken in dismissing Scandinavia, stressing that Sweden would remain vital for trade with Nordic countries once shipping resumed. Matsuoka assured him that Matsushima's reassignment to Germany was necessary and not a reflection of Japan's regard for Sweden. He claimed that the delay in designating a new envoy was solely due to a lack of qualified personnel. However, either the foreign ministry was short on skilled diplomats, or Matsuoka may not have been entirely truthful. Throughout his tenure, which ended that summer, he did not appoint a new envoy, nor did his successors see any diplomatic value in doing so. It took nearly 2 years for Japan to send a replacement. During that time, only 3 Japanese diplomats were stationed in Sweden, and the foreign ministry did not even assign a consul to Stockholm. The only extra representative was an honorary consul in Gothenburg, who was actually a Swede and had been in that position since 1934. The military attaché and his deputy were sent by the army, not the foreign ministry. The lack of representation from the foreign ministry, only the chargé d'affaires, strongly indicates that it had little interest in Sweden as a center for trade and diplomacy. For 2 long years, Stockholm was largely ignored, even though it became a protecting power for Japan after 1941. The Gaimusho determined that 1 chargé d'affaires in Stockholm and a Swedish minister in Tokyo were sufficient for managing bilateral relations. In Tokyo, Bagé faced another challenge, ensuring the safety of his fellow countrymen and his legation. In July 1941, he sent a cable to the UD expressing concern about the uncertain situation and suggested that the legation's secret archives had become a liability that he wished to destroy. While there was no immediate threat to the diplomats, since the Gaimusho had always adhered to international diplomatic norms, there was uncertainty about whether the military police, known as the Kenpeitai, would do the same. If relations between Sweden and Japan soured, the legation could be at risk. Although such an event didn't happen, Bagé's concerns were reasonable. Enemy embassies and legations faced searches by the Kenpeitai once war with the Allies began later that year. Even without that earlier insight, the expatriate community could see the worsening security situation for Westerners in Japan. Bagé noted that the dangers for all foreigners had escalated over the past year. Despite Sweden not being part of the Anglo-American alliance, which was edging closer to war, that offered no assurance of safety for Swedish citizens from the Kenpeitai. He warned that the possibility of Japan's entry into the war carries special risks for its white inhabitants due to the significant rise in xenophobia. Pressure was particularly intense against British nationals, culminating in a serious incident on July 27, 1940, when 12 Britons, all respected businessmen or professionals, were arrested across the nation in a coordinated crackdown amid concerns over espionage. Among those detained were both Swedish-British consuls, Frederick Ringer from Nagasaki and Ernest James from Kobe, charged with violating military secrets law. James was released after 5 days, but Ringer remained in custody for over a month. He was finally released, but sadly passed away later that year. Whether his death was linked to the arrest is unclear from the records. Another detainee, Melville James Cox, a Reuters journalist, tragically died in custody after falling from the 3rd floor of the Kenpeitai headquarters 2 days after his arrest. The Japanese police categorized the incident as a suicide, while British investigators concluded that Cox likely fell victim to severe mental strain during his interrogation, leading to his leap from the building. There were no signs of direct foul play. Nevertheless, many in the foreign community across Tokyo, Kobe, and Osaka suspected it was a targeted assassination. This event was a turning point for the expatriate community, signaling a decline in personal safety and prompting many to leave. Even those who had long called Japan home, like James, decided to depart. Japan had turned into a politically hostile environment. These developments understandably troubled Bagé. However, when faced with the question of whether Sweden should act diplomatically, he recommended against an official statement. He felt there was no need for an evacuation of the Swedish colony or a repatriation suggestion. He assured his ministry that he was in close contact with Swedish businesses to ensure the safety of their employees and that these companies would verify the validity of employee passports. But he argued that a complete evacuation seemed unwarranted given the financial interests involved. Although the circumstances weren't ideal, he felt they didn't constitute a life-or-death situation. Preserving Sweden's commercial stature mattered more than avoiding the suspicions of certain factions in Japan. Nonetheless, he acknowledged the seriousness of the situation and left it up to individuals to decide whether to stay or leave. Consequently, he sent out a survey to the 100 members of the expatriate community to gauge their preferences. By September 1941, only 13 Swedes, including 2 children, expressed a desire to return home, while the rest opted to remain. International events had spared Sweden from being drawn into the European conflict and had also deterred Japan from siding with Hitler. This circumstance muted Swedish criticism of Japan's actions in China, allowing Swedish-Japanese relations to continue on a business-as-usual path. Once it became apparent that Japan aimed to remain neutral, both Japanese and American newspapers predicted significant economic growth, recalling how neutral trade had surged during the First World War. Although this could have signaled a new era of economic partnership between Stockholm and Tokyo, challenges quickly emerged. The first clear sign of this is the almost total absence of trade records for the years 1940 to 1945 in the Swedish statistical yearbooks. The only official data available are import figures for 1944 and 1945, showing that Sweden imported goods worth 634,000 Swedish kroner and 277,000 Swedish kroner, respectively. While these figures indicate that trade between Sweden and Japan never entirely halted, they reflect a mere 5% of the 10 million Swedish kroner worth of goods imported in 1939. Japanese statistics are similarly inconsistent, although they cover trade for a longer duration into the conflict. Goods exported to Sweden had data collected until 1941. Interestingly, data on imports from Sweden was gathered for every year up to 1945, which showcases Japan's impressive administrative ability to manage import controls even as its empire was crumbling. These figures illustrate the gradual collapse of bilateral trade between Sweden and Japan. From 1939 to 1941, the value of Swedish exports to Japan fell by approximately 30% each year. Bagge was clearly striving to counter this trend, yet 1940 brought new trade hurdles. The number of Swedish ships calling at Japanese ports was cut in half. The maritime route between Sweden and Japan suffered due to the perilous situation in European waters. Consequently, the land route through Siberia, Moscow, and Tallinn to Stockholm became more significant. But in August, the Soviet government began requiring certificates of origin for transporting Japanese goods. These certificates could only be obtained from the Soviet embassy in Tokyo, which Bagge noted was not without difficulties in a September 1940 report. He urged the UD to negotiate minimum freight contingents and establish a local agent in Vladivostok to help speed up the clearance of Japanese goods traded by Swedish companies. This plan seemed effective for the initial months, with positive signals from the Japanese side as well. Bagge received a principal agreement from the Japanese finance minister that the export of non-essential goods to Sweden would still be permitted in the coming months. Trade figures for that time remained robust. He reported that between August 19th and October 23rd, he had processed documents for the transit of 3,030 tons of cotton, wool, and knitted items, valued at yen 6.4 million. Considering that the UD had announced in February of that same year a 1-to-1 exchange rate, 1 crown for 1 yen, the 2-month export average was notably high, even compared to 1939. About half of the transport was conducted via Siberia, while the other half was by ship. However, this trend didn't last long. By early January 1941, cargo transport through Siberia was halted due to Soviet regulations that required rerouting traffic exclusively to the German Königsberg and the Japan Railway's limited capacity on that route. This situation led to increased taxes and the need for waybills, effectively making transport nearly impossible. The Swedes found themselves waiting for the resolution of Soviet-Japanese transit agreements, as well as trying to negotiate extra space with Japan Railways on their Siberian lines. The sea route faced challenges too. In 1938, 47 Swedish ships docked at Yokohama, and 40 the following year, but that number dropped to 25 in 1940, with no ships arriving at Yokohama in 1941. Not only did the sea passage grow riskier due to the ongoing war in Europe, but it also became much more complex. Britain began to patrol the seas, insisting that neutral cargo obtain navicerts to be permitted passage. A navicert, or navigational certificate, acted like a passport for neutral trade, confirming that the cargo on neutral vessels was not heading to an enemy port. The navicert system was a British strategy aimed at outmaneuvering Germany through strong naval oversight. Unlike passports, navicerts could not be acquired by those wanting to trade. They could only be issued by the British government through its diplomatic channels abroad. These authorities could refuse to issue navicerts if they suspected trade with the enemy or if goods were deemed contraband. Thus, navicerts became a tool for widening the sea blockade against enemy nations, a tactic that infringed on international law, yet had proven effective for Britain in the First World War. For neutral nations like Sweden, this was a significant violation of their right to trade with both sides. However, given Britain's dominance over large portions of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, there was little that could be done against this unilateral policy. Bagge had to keep applying for navicerts, a process that could stretch on for weeks since it required proof of the final destinations for each shipment, with separate navicerts needed for different cargoes. Rejections were common. During 1940 and 1941, Bagge and the UD consistently protested the denial of navicerts for Swedish ships traveling to and from Japan, but their efforts often fell flat. Many trade deals ended up stalling because, even when negotiations between Swedish and Japanese parties were successful, shipments could still be blocked. The most significant setback occurred in October 1941 when a planned export of 125 tons of Swedish nickel and 12 tons of cadmium failed to secure British navicerts despite months of preparation. This clearly reflected London's skepticism towards Tokyo, which had not yet entered the war. From May 1940 onward, refusals for navicerts for all Swedish-Japanese trade became common. Consequently, exporting and importing grew increasingly challenging as the political climate worsened and traffic routes became less secure. Nearly every shipment required negotiations involving at least 2 or 3 parties, such as Japan, the USSR, Britain, and Germany, as well as sometimes Japanese railway companies. Goods had to navigate through land and sea territories that were controlled by others and required licenses. Nevertheless, the Swedes weren't ready to give up. As late as March 1941, Bagge informed the Foreign Ministry about significant Japanese interest in importing Swedish pulp, paper, and steel worth 7 million yen through Mitsubishi Corporation. He urged his ministry to leverage this chance to demand comparable imports from Japan. Most likely, he aimed to increase soybean imports from Manchukuo. However, trade reciprocity had to be mutual. To issue an import permit for these Swedish products, the Japanese authorities insisted on a state guarantee from Bagge that Sweden would import goods from Japan of equal value. They were unwilling to allow the long-standing trade deficit with Sweden to persist, even though it was large Japanese firms and Mitsubishi that initiated these requests. Additionally, rising political tensions between Japan and the United States prompted Japan to consider abandoning the use of US dollars for overseas transactions, opting instead for the German Reichsmark in trade with Europe. Sweden's top exporter, SKF, had begun talks with its trading partners about settling bills in German currency. But Bagge proposed a different solution, a real Swedish-Japanese clearing system. This approach aimed to eliminate the reliance on a third currency, reducing uncertainty over money availability. Bagge suggested using a Swedish crown account for Japan at Enskilda Banken, a private bank, alongside a Swedish-owned yen account at the Yokohama Specie Bank. His idea was well received, especially by the YSB, which was keen to advance the plan. Adjustments were made on the Swedish side that left Enskilda Banken out of the loop. Ultimately, the agreement was reached between the YSB and Sweden's central bank, Riksbank, with the approval of Gunnar Hägglöf, head of the Trade Department at the UD, taking effect on May 28, 1941. However, global events soon disrupted these plans. Just weeks later, on June 22nd, Operation Barbarossa saw Germany invade the Soviet Union, turning Japan's ally into an adversary. Although Japan maintained neutrality toward the USSR, the chaos from the German attack was significant. Trade with Europe came to a standstill for weeks. Goods from Japan's mainland and exports from Manchukuo could no longer transit through Siberia, as Königsberg became enemy territory and the Estonian port of Tallinn became a conflict zone. The limited maritime routes offered some options for transporting goods to or from Japan, but these were handled in German Reichsmark, Argentinian pesos, or Swiss francs. In this context, the Swedish-Japanese clearing system had a limited effect. Especially in the later years, the Swiss franc gained more favor than the Swedish crown in Japan, due to its broader acceptance in international dealings, thanks to the Swiss National Bank's prominence in global finance, and the fact that the Swiss franc was the primary currency for the Bank for International Settlements, which operated throughout the war. However, the direct clearing system between Sweden and Japan remained a viable option for settling payments, provided both parties accepted each other's currency, which occasionally benefited Swedish trading companies. By the time Hitler invaded Poland, Sweden's perspective on Japan had shifted significantly. It evolved from a relationship primarily based on trade interests before 1930 to one marked by trade under protest during the early years of Japan's expansion, and eventually back to trade without protest as international chaos re-emerged. Developments at the League of Nations played a crucial role in this transformation. Following the unsuccessful sanctions against Italy and Japan, along with a joint declaration from European neutrals, Swedish foreign policy grew increasingly cautious. The alarming new global landscape, characterized by hostile great power blocs and a decreasing regard for international agreements, prompted calls for a return to Swedish neutrality. At the start of the 1930s, this stance had few advocates among Swedish politicians, with a common belief that neutrality contradicted League membership. However, between 1936 and 1939, the tide shifted. After a period of internal debates, all government parties united in favor of reinstating Swedish neutrality, effectively abandoning the collective security stance associated with the League. Simultaneously, Japan adopted a neutral approach in the impending European conflict, cloaked in the rhetoric of non-involvement. Faced with challenges from the Soviet Union in Nomonhan and taken aback by Germany's unexpected non-aggression pact with Stalin, Tokyo decided to concentrate on its military efforts in China while maintaining normal relations with other nations. Unlike Sweden, Japan's strategy included the important distinction of keeping the option open to enter the war later. Under these conditions, Swedish-Japanese trade could have continued as usual after 1939, but it eventually faced disruptions due to external factors. The perils of the high seas, coupled with Britain's determination to regulate commerce to and from Europe through navicerts, alongside obstacles in securing transit permits from the Soviet Union, led to a decrease in trade. Within Japan, the situation for Swedish citizens grew more precarious due to an increase in attacks against Westerners. Nonetheless, neither Minister Wedar Bag nor the Foreign Ministry deemed the situation severe enough to warrant an evacuation. Only 10% of the Swedish colony departed from the empire prior to the Pearl Harbor attack. Altogether, in the first 2 years of the war in Europe, Swedish-Japanese relations shifted noticeably towards bilateralism, with Swedish diplomacy playing a growing role in trade matters. This trend would become even more evident during the tumultuous years of the war in the Pacific.